Right now, in a handful of labs you've never fully understood, engineers are running experiments they don't talk about publicly. Not because they're hiding a monster, because they're not sure yet what they've built. And in the space of 18 months, a year and a half, shorter than a college semester and a summer combined, the entire architecture of human work, trust, and power could be rewritten. Most people are planning for a future that arrives gradually. It won't. So let's walk through it. Not the movie version, not the robot uprising, not the glowing red eyes, not the countdown clock on a giant screen somewhere in a bunker. The real version. The quiet, procedural, oddly boring version, because that's usually how history actually happens. Rome didn't fall in an afternoon. The internet didn't arrive in a single headline. And artificial general intelligence, when it actually shows up, will not announce itself with a bang. It will slip into the world the way most transformative technologies do, through a software update, a quiet product launch, a research paper that nobody outside a small community reads carefully enough. Here's the first thing almost nobody accounts for. AGI does not arrive as a single event with a single date. It arrives as a threshold that different people cross at different times, in different rooms, using different definitions. Inside the lab that builds it, the researchers might recognize it weeks or months before the public does. There will be internal memos, quiet celebrations, maybe a few sleepless nights spent testing the system against problems it was never explicitly trained to solve. And then there will be silence. Because the moment a lab believes it has built something that can reason, plan, and adapt across nearly any domain the way a human can, or better, the instinct is not to shout. The instinct is to verify, to test, to make absolutely sure this isn't a mirage, a lucky string of benchmark scores that collapses under real pressure. That verification period alone can eat the first month or two of your 18. While you are imagining sirens, the actual people closest to the moment are running the same test 5 different ways, arguing about definitions, and drafting careful language for a blog post that will undersell what they've actually seen, because overselling it is worse for everyone. So, month 1 looks like almost nothing to the outside world. A slightly more capable model update, a research paper, a cryptic tweet, maybe a stock price move that reverses by Friday. Underneath that surface, though, something has already started to shift, and it's not the technology itself. It's the behavior of the people who understand what's coming. Engineers inside frontier labs start acting differently. Some leave for smaller, faster-moving teams, betting they can do more with less oversight. Others stay and quietly become the most important people in the building, because they're the ones who understand what the system can actually do, not what the marketing page claims. Investors who catch wind of internal capability jumps start repositioning, sometimes before the public announcement, and you'll see it in acquisition patterns and hiring sprees long before you see it in a press release. This is one of the strange truths about the early period after AGI arrives. The people with the most information behave first, and they behave quietly, and by the time the rest of the world catches up, the shape of the future has already started to bend. Now let's talk about deployment, because this is where most predictions go wrong. People assume that once a lab has AGI, it floods the world with it immediately, like flipping a switch that lights up every building on the grid at once. That's not what happens. The first deployments are narrow, controlled, and often invisible to the public. Government-adjacent projects, defense-related research, internal use inside the company that built it, where the system is set loose on its own code base, its own research problems, its own scientific bottlenecks, because that's the safest place to learn what it can and can't be trusted with. Large-scale deployment into the broader workforce and the broader economy tends to lag the actual technical milestone by 6 months or more. That gap is not laziness. It's the incredibly unglamorous work of building interfaces, safety rails, monitoring systems, legal frameworks, and enterprise integrations, sturdy enough that a company with 10,000 employees can plug this thing into its operations without the entire structure catching fire. Even a superintelligent system needs a working API, a compliance and review, and someone in a legal department signing off on liability. History doesn't move at the speed of capability. It moves at the speed of bureaucracy trying to catch up with capability, and that friction is where a huge chunk of your 18 months actually lives. But make no mistake, the acceleration inside the lab itself is real, and it compounds faster than anything most people are prepared for. Once a system becomes good enough to meaningfully assist with its own research and development, you get a feedback loop. The AI helps design better training methods. Those better training methods produce a more capable AI. That AI, in turn, accelerates the next round of research even further. This is the part of the timeline that researchers describe as the most unpredictable, because trend lines that looked smooth and linear for years suddenly start bending upward in ways that break the old assumptions. Some forecasts put the gap between an AI system capable of doing the job of a top human research engineer and something approaching full superintelligence at around a single year, sometimes less. If that holds even loosely, then somewhere inside your 18-month window, the entire character of the story changes. What started as a narrow deployment problem becomes something closer to a civilizational inflection point. And it happens fast enough that the institutions meant to respond to it, governments, regulators, courts, are still debating definitions, while the technical ground has already shifted twice. Let's bring this down to human scale, because abstractions about research loops don't capture what it actually feels like to live through this. Picture a mid-level manager at a logistics company. 6 months in, she notices her team's software engineers are shipping code faster than she can review it, because half of them are pairing with an AI system that writes, tests, and documents entire modules in the time it used to take a junior engineer to draft a single function. At first, this looks like a productivity win, and everyone celebrates it as one. By month 9, though, she's doing the math differently. The team that used to need 12 people to hit its targets now needs 4, plus the AI tooling subscription. Nobody got fired in a dramatic afternoon. People just weren't replaced when they left. Contracts weren't renewed. Headcount requests got quietly denied. This is the actual mechanism of workforce disruption in the early post-AGI period, and it's almost invisible from the outside, because there's no single layoff announcement to point to. There's just a slow, steady erosion of the number of humans required to produce the same output, distributed across thousands of companies making the same quiet calculation independently. Meanwhile, somewhere else entirely, a 22-year-old with no institutional backing, no venture funding, and a few $100s a month in API costs is building a product that would have required a 50-person engineering team 3 years earlier. This is the part of the story that gets less attention than the job losses, but it matters just as much. Because AGI doesn't just remove labor from the equation, it also removes the barriers that used to protect incumbents. A small agency that built its business on having senior expertise and proprietary process finds that clients can now get most of that value directly from AI tools at a fraction of the cost, without the agency in the middle at all. Real cases like this already existed even before AGI properly arrived, with agencies losing significant portions of their revenue over 18 to 24-month stretches as clients realized they could self-serve. Post-AGI, that dynamic doesn't stay contained to marketing agencies. It spreads into law, into consulting, into parts of medicine, into architecture and design, into any field where the actual value used to be locked inside a person's years of trained judgment. What survives, oddly, isn't raw execution ability. It's taste, it's trust. It's the kind of relationship where a client picks a specific person because they trust that person's judgment calls, not because that person can technically produce the output faster than a machine, because increasingly they can't. No, there's a part of this story that's less about spreadsheets and more about something stranger, something closer to the emotional texture of daily life. Within the first 6 months of AGI systems becoming broadly capable and broadly available, expect the emergence, or really the rapid maturation, of AI companionship at a scale that dwarfs anything that existed before. Not clunky chatbots, something that remembers your history with it, adapts to your specific patterns of speech and need, and shows up for you with a kind of consistency that flawed, busy, distracted humans often can't match. Early, immature versions of this were already visible before AGI in the popularity of AI companion apps among people who were lonely, isolated, or simply curious. Once the underlying intelligence jumps to something closer to general reasoning, those systems stop feeling like toys. They start feeling, for a meaningful slice of the population, like relationships. This raises questions that no government, no religious institution, and no philosophy department has fully worked out answers to. And those questions won't wait politely for academic consensus. They'll show up in courtrooms, in custody disputes, in public health data, in the quiet, private choices of millions of people deciding who or what they turn to when they need to feel understood. Which brings us to the part of the 18 months that almost every serious forecast agrees on, even when they disagree about everything else. There will be backlash. Public deployment of a system this capable, especially once its economic effects become visible in unemployment data, and its social effects become visible in how people relate to it, tends to trigger exactly the kind of reaction you'd expect from any population watching the rules of their lives get rewritten without a vote. Expect protests. Expect them to be larger and more organized than the scattered gig worker demonstrations that preceded them. Because by this point, the disruption isn't limited to rideshare drivers or freelance writers. It's touching white-collar professionals who assumed their education had inoculated them against exactly this kind of displacement. Expect those protests to shape policy in real time, not because protest. There's also a geopolitical dimension that almost nobody outside foreign policy circles thinks about carefully enough, and it deserves real attention here. Whichever nation or company crosses the AGI threshold first does not get to keep that advantage quietly to themselves for long, because the incentives on every other major power are to close that gap as fast as possible. by any means available, including espionage, aggressive recruitment of talent, and enormous state-backed compute investment. Expect the 18 months after AGI to be marked by an intensification, not a resolution, of the international race dynamic that's been building for years already. This matters directly to how deployment unfolds, because a lab or a government operating under the belief that a rival is close behind them will take more risks with rollout speed than they would in a world where they felt they had a comfortable lead. Rushed deployment, driven by competitive fear rather than confidence and safety, is one of the most consistently cited risks across serious forecasts of this period, and it's the kind of risk that doesn't show up cleanly in a headline. It shows up in the small decisions, the safety review that gets shortened, the red teaming process that gets compressed, the caution that gets quietly deprioritized because the team down the hall or the country across the ocean might not be extending the same caution to themselves. Let's pull back for a moment and talk about what doesn't happen, because the gaps between prediction and reality tell you almost as much as the predictions themselves. Despite what a lot of the more dramatic scenarios suggest, most people's day-to-day lives in the first several months do not transform overnight. You still commute if you have a job that requires it. You still pay rent, buy groceries, argue with your family about small things that have nothing to do with artificial intelligence. The transformation is real, but it's unevenly distributed, and it's initially concentrated in specific sectors, specific job categories, specific kinds of knowledge work that happen to map cleanly onto what these systems are best at. Sectors that require physical presence, hands-on trust, or deeply embodied human judgment change more slowly, not because they're immune, but because the bottleneck for those industries was never purely cognitive in the first place. A plumber's job doesn't disappear in month 4. A radiologist's job might shrink, but the humans in that field don't vanish either. They shift toward oversight, toward the parts of the job that still require a license, a liability signature, and a human willing to be accountable when something goes wrong. And this is maybe the most important thread running through the entire 18 months. Accountability doesn't automatically transfer to the machine, no matter how capable it becomes. Somebody still has to be legally and morally responsible when an AI system gives a wrong medical recommendation, misjudges a loan application, or authorizes a transaction that turns out to be catastrophic. That unresolved question, who is actually on the hook when a system this capable makes a consequential mistake, becomes one of the defining fights of this period, playing out in courtrooms, insurance markets, and legislative committees simultaneously. Insurance companies in particular become quietly powerful actors here, because they're the ones who have to price the risk of deploying autonomous systems into consequential decisions, and their actuarial tables end up functioning as a kind of de facto regulation long before formal government rules catch up. If insurers refuse to underwrite a certain category of AI deployment, that deployment effectively doesn't happen at scale, regardless of what the technology is capable of. Now, let's talk about the upside, because this story isn't only about disruption and anxiety, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. Scientific research is one of the areas where the compounding effects of AGI show up fastest and most positively. Fields that have been bottlenecked for decades by the sheer slowness of human hypothesis generation and experimental design start moving at a different pace entirely. Drug discovery pipelines that used to take a decade from target identification to clinical trials start compressing, not because the biology of clinical trials suddenly changes. Human bodies still take time to respond to treatments and reveal side effects, but because the upstream research, the identification of promising compounds, the modeling of how a molecule might behave, the design of more efficient trials gets dramatically faster. Material science, clean energy research, and parts of climate modeling see similar effects. This is genuinely one of the places where more optimistic, long-term forecasts about AGI's benefits start to feel less like marketing copy and more like a plausible trajectory, even if the full payoff, cures for diseases, breakthroughs in energy storage, takes years rather than the 18 months this story is focused on. What you get within the window itself is the beginning of that curve, the first wave of research results that make scientists in affected fields sit up and pay closer attention well before the broader public notices anything has changed. There's a psychological dimension to all of this that deserves more honesty than it usually gets. For a certain kind of person, someone whose entire sense of identity and value was built around being the smartest person in a room or the most capable problem solver on a team, well, the 18 months after AGI arrives can feel less like an economic disruption and more like a quiet identity crisis. It's one thing to know intellectually that a machine might eventually outperform you at complex reasoning. It's another thing entirely to sit across from a colleague or a screen and watch it happen in real time, week after week, on problems you use to consider the core of your professional worth. Researchers who study this transition describe it less as fear of unemployment and more as a kind of quiet grief, a mourning for a version of human specialness that a lot of people didn't realize they were emotionally attached to until it started slipping away. This isn't something policy can easily fix. It's something that plays out in therapy offices and support groups that don't exist yet but will, in quiet conversations, between people trying to figure out what it means to be valuable in a world where raw cognitive output is no longer a scarce human resource. So what does the end of the 18-month window actually look like if you had to describe it in a single scene? Not a robot uprising, not a utopia either, something messier and more human than either extreme. A labor market that's been reshaped but not erased, with clear winners in fields built on trust, taste, and accountability, and clear losers in fields that were purely about fast, repeatable cognitive execution. A regulatory landscape that's been hastily assembled in response to protests and scandals, full of rules that will look outdated within another. 18 months. But that represent real, hard-fought political compromise in the moment they were passed. A geopolitical situation that's more tense, not less, because the race dynamic that drove the rushed early deployment hasn't resolved. It's just found a new equilibrium at a higher level of capability on all sides. A scientific research ecosystem that's visibly accelerating, producing early results that hint at a genuinely different future for medicine and energy, even if the full transformation is still years away. And millions of individual people, in millions of individual rooms, quietly renegotiating what it means to be useful, to be valued, to be human, in a world where the machine sitting next to them can, for the first time in history, actually keep up. The mistake almost everyone makes when they try to picture this period is imagining it as a single dramatic turning point, a moment you could point to on a calendar and say, that's when everything changed. It won't feel like that from the inside. It will feel like a sequence of small adjustments that only look dramatic in retrospect, the way you don't notice a river carving a canyon while you're standing at the bottom of it. You only see the depth of the cut when you finally climb out and look back. 18 months from the real threshold, whenever that threshold actually arrives, most people will still be going to work, still be arguing about grocery prices, still be falling in love and getting divorced and raising kids and worrying about things that have nothing to do with artificial intelligence at all. And underneath all of that ordinary human noise, the entire structure of who does what, who gets paid for what, who's trusted with what, will have quietly, unevenly, irreversibly shifted. That's the real story of the 18 months after AGI, not an explosion. A tide, slow enough to miss day by day and impossible to deny once you finally look up and notice how far the water has come in. Let's go back and sit inside a few more rooms, because the abstractions only mean something once you picture the actual people living through them. Consider a financial markets desk, 3 months into the window. Analysts who used to spend their mornings building models by hand now spend their mornings reviewing models in AI built overnight, checking assumptions rather than generating them. Trading volumes tied to AI-driven strategies spike unpredictably, sometimes triggering the kind of flash volatility that used to require a genuine crisis to produce. Regulators who oversee these markets are working from rulebooks written for human-paced decisions, and they find themselves perpetually a step behind, drafting emergency guidance for scenarios that already happened last week. This is one of the quieter risks of the period. Not that markets crash spectacularly, but that the ordinary mechanisms designed to catch mistakes start operating too slowly relative to the speed at which mistakes now compound. Consider, too, a classroom, because education is one of the sectors where the disruption is both obvious and strangely slow to resolve. Within months, students have access to tutoring quality once reserved for the wealthiest families, a patient, endlessly knowledgeable assistant available at any hour, capable of explaining a concept 7 different ways until it finally clicks. This should be an unambiguous win, and in many ways it is. But institutions built around grading and credentialing don't know what to do with a world where the line between a student's own understanding and an AI's assistance has become genuinely blurry. Universities spend the early months locked in furious debates about academic integrity, while a quieter, more consequential shift happens underneath them. Employers slowly stop caring as much about the credential and start caring more about what a person can actually do when the AI tools are turned off. There's also the matter of small business owners, a group that gets less attention in most of these forecasts than it deserves. A single location accounting firm, a boutique law practice, a regional architecture studio. These businesses often move faster than large corporations, precisely because they don't have layers of governance slowing them down. Within the first 6 months, many small business owners quietly become the earliest and most aggressive adopters of AGI-level tools, not because they're reckless, but because the economics are too obvious to ignore. A 2-person firm that can suddenly produce the output of a 10-person firm doesn't need a boardroom debate to make that call. This produces a strange, uneven landscape where some of the fastest transformation happens in the least visible corners of the economy, in strip malls and small offices, where a handful of people quietly figure out how to do far more with far less, long before anyone writes a case study about it. Healthcare deserves its own moment here, because the stakes are higher and the caution is appropriately greater. Diagnostic support tools improve rapidly in the first several months, catching patterns in imaging and lab data that human specialists sometimes miss, particularly in high-volume, understaffed settings where fatigue already degrades human accuracy. But actual clinical deployment moves far more cautiously than the technology itself would allow, because medicine operates under a liability and trust structure that took a century to build. Doctors become, in this window, something closer to expert reviewers of AI-generated assessments rather than the sole source of diagnostic judgment, a shift some embrace as relief from an impossible workload, and others experience as a slow erosion of the identity they trained a decade for. Patients split roughly into two camps: those who trust the AI-assisted diagnosis more because it draws on a dataset no single doctor could hold in their head, and those who trust it less because no human is fully steering the decision anymore, and that gap in trust becomes its own quiet political issue. It's also worth talking honestly about the information environment during this period, because it degrades in ways that are easy to underestimate. The same capability that lets an AI system draft a brilliant research paper also lets it draft a flawless piece of political disinformation, indistinguishable in tone from genuine journalism. Within months of broad availability, the volume of synthetic content online increases sharply, not because most people are using it maliciously, but because the sheer scale of what a small number of bad actors can produce increases by orders of magnitude. Platforms scramble to build detection systems. And for a while, it becomes a genuine arms race. Detection tools trained against generation tools that are, in turn, trained to evade detection. Trust in any single piece of online content degrades faster than most institutions are prepared to handle, and that uncertainty becomes its own social cost. Because once people can no longer easily tell what's real, they start discounting everything, including the information they actually need. None of this happens in a straight line, and that's worth emphasizing before we close. Different countries move at different speeds, shaped by different regulatory instincts, different labor protections, different appetites for risk. Some governments respond to early disruption with aggressive safety nets and expanded retraining, betting that a softer landing now prevents a harder political reckoning later. Others respond by doing very little, trusting markets to sort out the adjustment on their own, and those countries tend to see sharper social friction within the window, because the pain of transition isn't cushioned by anything. This divergence becomes one of the most interesting natural experiments of the era, different societies running different versions of the same transition at once, and by the end of the 18 months, early data on which approach produced less suffering starts to become genuinely visible, even if it's far too early to call a final verdict. And that's precisely why the disagreement over timing matters so much less than people think it does. Whether this window opens in 18 months or 5 years, the shape of what happens inside it barely changes. Because the shape isn't really about the technology's raw capability, it's about how slowly human institutions adapt to any capability jump, no matter how large. The lesson from every previous general-purpose technology, electricity, the internet, even the printing press centuries earlier, is the same. The technology moves fast. Everything built around it, the laws, the norms, the emotional adjustments, the new professional identities, moves slow. And that gap between the two speeds is where almost all the interesting and difficult parts of this story actually live. The 18 months after AGI won't be defined by what the AI does. They'll be defined by how painfully, unevenly, and creatively humans scramble to keep up with what it can already do the moment it arrives. That's not a prediction about robots. That's a prediction about us, and it's the only part of this story you can actually bet on with real confidence, because we've done this dance before, just never with a partner this fast.